Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we take up the analysis of today's newspaper, let me remind you that if you feel our initiatives to be helpful in your preparation, do let us know by liking the videos and by sharing your feedback in the comment section. And also don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by taking up a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column has been written by two senior officials of the European Union, and it deals with the Global Gateway Initiative of the European Union and how it provides an opportunity for like minded democracies such as India to work along with the EU in creating sustainable and inclusive infrastructure projects around the world with the objective of establishing mutually beneficial connectivity links and not with the intention of creating one sided dependencies. See, to understand this argument of the writers, first you need to understand what is the Global Gateway Initiative that has been recently launched by the European Union. This is an ambitious connectivity project of the European Union through which it aims to fund and build several critical infrastructure projects around the world, which includes not just physical infrastructure but also the creation of digital infrastructure and the establishment of climate friendly green projects. The vision of the EU is to enable the smaller and weaker countries to fulfill their digital transition and green transition so that these recipient countries could also reap the benefits of a globalized economy. For this purpose, the EU is looking to invest around 300 billion euros or approximately around 340 billion US dollars. And these investments are set to be made between the period 2021 to 2027. As per the plans of the EU, the funding will be arranged as a mix of loans and grants, which will be financed not just by the European Union, but also by the EU member states, including Europe based financial and development agencies and institutions, such as the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Then the project also envisions to mobilize private investments from Europe based businesses so that a mix of public and private funds could be channeled into like minded countries in order to establish this ambitious global connectivity project of the EU. Considering the scale and scope of this initiative, strategic experts have labeled the initiative as a rival and as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. While China's Belt and Road Initiative has invited a lot of criticism, as China is seen to be funding only strategic projects and not economically viable projects, which in turn is said to have pushed many smaller countries into a debt trap. So, this has led several experts in several countries to criticize Chinese investments as one sided investments which benefit only the strategic interests of China and ends up turning the small recipient countries into a dependency, and hence BRI investments have been branded as opaque investments where there is no transparency, and it is said to benefit only Chinese strategic interests while pushing the smaller countries into a debt trap. So while China's BRI initiative has attracted such criticism, the European Union, through its Global Gateway Initiative, is looking to counter the Chinese dominance in global infrastructure by funding and establishing a parallel infrastructure of its own. Through this initiative, the EU is looking to play a key role in establishing key global infrastructure projects to enable the digital and green transition of the global economy and to counter China's one sided projects and authoritarian values. The EU is looking to base the Global Gateway Initiative on the strong foundation of democratic values. Through this ambitious project, the EU is looking to work with like minded democracies around the world, such as India, to create and invest in infrastructure projects that are transparent, equitable, mutually beneficial, and inclusive. The writers point out that through the Global Gateway Initiative, the European Union can create partnerships with like-minded democracies such as US, Brazil, and India to help establish such mutually beneficial equitable projects which could help counter the current one-sided domination of China in the global economy. The writers point out that EU's Global Gateway Initiative can easily synchronize with other similar initiatives that it has already taken up with countries like US, Brazil, and India. For example, through the G7 grouping, which is primarily led by the United States, the democratic industrialized nations of the world, along with the European Union, have taken up the B3W initiative or the Build Back Better World initiative, which also aims to support and fund global infrastructure projects with the intention of countering China's Belt and Road Initiative. Then the EU and Brazil are also working on a project known as the BELA, which stands for Building the European Link to Latin America, through which the EU and Brazil are establishing an optical fiber cable that connects the two continents of Europe and Latin America, and it aims to not just enable the faster transfer of data between the two continents, but it also hopes to boost the data based economy of the future, along with giving equal priority to data privacy of the individuals. The writers point out how the European Union has adopted one of the strongest data privacy laws, which is known as the GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union. On similar lines, recently Brazil also has enacted a data protection law, and the Bella project, which has established a OFC link between Europe and Latin America, is also governed by the very same data protection laws. So, on one hand, as China is looking to weaponize its monopoly on data, like-minded democracies such as the members of EU and Latin American countries like Brazil are taking up digital projects which are giving utmost importance to data protection and data privacy. The writers also point out that China has not only weaponized its monopoly over data, but it is also looking to weaponize its disproportionate control over global supply chains, energy supplies, rare earth metals, semiconductor chips, and as well as vaccines and pharmaceutical ingredients. The writers point out that these factors have emerged as instruments of power in today's geopolitics, and China is not hesitating to weaponize its monopoly or disproportionate control over them in order to establish its global geopolitical dominance. So, as China is leveraging its control over supply chains, rare earth metals, semiconductors, and pharma ingredients for strategic benefits, the writers are calling upon democratic nations like US, India, and the European countries to come together and to support the Global Gateway Initiative of the EU so that a truly democratic and inclusive global infrastructure can be created, which will help in establishing connectivity links around the world without the intention of creating any dependencies or pushing any small countries into a debt trap. In this regard, India has a lot to offer to the European Union because the writers point out that recently India and the EU have signed the Connectivity Partnership, which seeks to expand their cooperation across digital, energy, transport, and people to people sectors in order to bring mutual benefits to both the regions. So, as India and EU already share strong relations and similar democratic and inclusive values, India has a lot to offer to the European Union to help strengthen its Global Gateway initiative. Similarly, the EU is also looking at African nations to further boost local development and internal economic growth by enabling the digital and green transition of African nations through the Global Gateway initiative to help the African countries to fully leverage the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So, in such infrastructure projects of the EU, India can be an ideal partner because India is also very much interested in investing in such mutually beneficial projects in the African continent. So, through such partnerships between democratic nations, a sustainable and inclusive global infrastructure can be created, which can not only benefit the sponsoring countries and the private investors, but can also benefit the local people to help them fulfill their aspirations. Now let's take up an important column from the last page of the online edition of The Hindu. This column was published in the Hindu newspaper last year to mark the International Day of Democracy, which has been designated on the 15th of September by the United Nations. In this column, the writer evaluates the state of democracy in India, and the arguments made by the writer can be very important for polity and as well as for a possible related essay topic. See, the Hindu has brought back this column because recently Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi took part in the Summit for Democracy, which was organized by US President Joe Biden, and he said that India is ready to share its expertise in organizing free and fair elections and in increasing transparency in all areas of governance through innovative digital solutions. So, this brought into focus the state of democracy not just in India, but as well as the state of democracy around the world. See, in the context of India, it is considered to be the world's largest functional democracy. This is absolutely true and a right assessment when you are looking at democracy as just a form of government. According to the writer, a true democracy is not just about the form of the government or the structure and composition of the state, but it is also about the people and their satisfaction. See, if you look at the form of the Indian state, it is natural to conclude that India is a successful democracy. Because in India, we have a written constitution which guarantees a set of rights and liberties to the citizens, and all the other essential aspects of a democracy are followed, which includes the universal adult suffrage, where all adults above the age of 18 years are eligible to vote and participate in elections without any discrimination or restrictions. Then the country does witness periodic elections and free and fair elections, following which we also witness a peaceful transfer of power. Then, as per the textbook definition of a democracy, India does have an independent press and an independent judiciary. So, these are generally seen as the hallmark of a functional democracy, and rightfully, India is often labeled as the world's largest functional democracy. But this is where the writer raises an important question. He is asking whether a democracy is just about the form of the government and the structure of the state. While the form of the state definitely helps in determining the extent of democracy in a country, the writer argues that a true democracy would also consider the status of its people and the extent of their satisfaction. Because democracy is not just about the state or the form of the government, but also about the people who comprise the state and the socio-economic outcomes that the government is able to achieve, which in turn decides the extent of satisfaction of the people. If a functional democratic state is unable to register these socio-economic outcomes, and if it is unable to satisfy the aspirations of the people, then questions definitely arise over the quality of democracy in that country. This is where the writer points out that while India is the largest functional democracy in the world, and while the form and structure of the Indian state definitely matches the definition of a functional democracy, its quality is truly questionable on the account of poor socio-economic outcomes achieved by the Indian state, which has failed to truly satisfy the Indian people. He points out how India performs very poorly on the account of most important indicators and parameters. If you look at the UN World Happiness Report of 2020, India has been ranked 144th out of 153 countries. Then, if you look at the UN Human Development Index report of 2019, India again ranks very poorly at 129th position out of 189 countries. According to the writer, this poor socio-economic performance of India is a direct result of the failure of the Indian state in delivering on governance. The writer argues that a true democracy is about its people and about the rights and liberties they enjoy, and about the kind of capabilities they possess. To guarantee these rights and liberties of the people and to provide the required capabilities to people, we need strong democratic institutions which are based on the power of the people. This is where a democratic state has a role to play. The state has to enable the creation of strong democratic institutions, which in turn can enable the people to enjoy their free rights and liberties, and as well as to deliver the right kind of capabilities to the people. Now, this could include the right of the people to question the government over its failure, or the liberty of the people to criticize the government and to oppose government policies which seek to restrict or contain the rights of the people. It would also include the capabilities of the people and democratic institutions with regard to healthcare, education, etc. If the people of a democratic state and if the democratic institutions in the country are given the right kind of capabilities and rights by the state, then they will possess the required strength to deliver on key socio-economic outcomes. But according to the writer, the Indian state has largely sought to restrict the rights and liberties of people, and over the decades, the Indian state has neglected its responsibility to strengthen the capabilities of our people and our democratic institutions. It is this weak performance of the Indian state which makes India a weak democracy, despite being referred to as the largest functional democracy. He points to examples in the United States and Western Europe as to how strong democracies are built. He refers to the tremendous human development and human achievement seen in West European countries and how this strengthens the capabilities of people, which allows them to hold their governments accountable. Then he also refers to the United States in the 1960s, where minorities such as blacks, women, and sexual minorities could lead strong civil rights movements against the government, which eventually led to the liberation and emancipation of these minorities. In India as well, these priorities of a democratic state were highlighted when India gained independence. Then leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, they explicitly highlighted the importance of creating strong democratic institutions which could ensure justice and fullness to the life of every man and woman in the country. But over the decades, subsequent governments have largely neglected these responsibilities of strengthening capabilities of our institutions and our people, and they have often sought to restrict the rights and liberties of the people. So, a combination of these policies of the state has led to the erosion of India's socio-economic outcomes, thus reducing the happiness and satisfaction of the Indian people. This leads the writer to conclude that the Indian democracy is a weak democracy that is loosely held together by a functional democratic state. He says that the Indian state is too attached to the procedures of democracy and to bureaucratic norms and procedures, whereas there is a complete lack of concern or awareness with regard to the implicit goal of a democracy, which is to satisfy the people and to enable the people to fully realize their aspirations. Now, for example, if you look at health and education, the Indian state has largely underinvested in these critical capabilities, and most of the state initiatives have been derailed because of its strict attachment and adherence to the procedures of democracy and to bureaucratic norms, whereas the rights of the people to question the government on the account of this failure has been curbed, and also the key institutions which could hold the state accountable have been weakened or quite often even neglected, thus leading to the overall poor socio-economic performance of India. So the solution to this lies in the hands of the state. The state has to make the right kind of investments to strengthen the capabilities of our institutions and our people so that the Indian state can truly become a strong and vibrant democracy. Next, in a column on page number 6, the writer Stanley Johnny argues that global geopolitics is headed towards a new disorder which has been triggered by the hasty withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. The writer points out that the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan and its undeclared defeat at the hands of the Taliban marks one of the most significant geopolitical events in the recent past. This American withdrawal has pushed the global order into chaos, thus leading to the emergence of a new world disorder, according to the writer. He compares this event with the fall of other superpowers in the past, such as the decline of British imperial power after the Second World War and the decline of the American power status following its retreat from the Vietnam War, and also with the disintegration of the Soviet Union that marked the end of the Cold War. See, the end of the Second World War marked the decline of British imperial power, and its superpower status formally ended with the Suez Crisis of 1956. This crisis was triggered by the Israeli attempt to capture and control the strategic Suez Canal with the backing of France and Britain. But as the strategy failed, it marked the end of Britain as a global superpower. Something similar happened in the 1970s, when during the Cold War, the US fought an unnecessary war in Vietnam, and finally, when it withdrew from the country in the 1970s, it was seen as a sign of weakness on its part. Such a sign of weakness on the part of a superpower is interpreted differently by its rivals and as well as by its allies. When a major superpower like Imperial Britain or the United States or the Soviet Union, when they suffer a defeat at the hands of a weaker power or a weaker force, it is often seen as a sign of weakness by both the rivals and allies, and the allies will start distancing themselves and will start rethinking their partnership with these superpowers, whereas the rivals will be further emboldened to instigate newer conflicts, thus pushing global geopolitics towards a new kind of disorder. So, such a disorder and realignment was seen in global geopolitics when Britain's imperial power status declined and when the American superpower status was questioned after the Vietnam War. In fact, this defeat of the US in the Vietnam War instigated the Soviet Union to meddle in Afghanistan and to invade the country in 1978-79 in order to extend its communist influence. Then, as the Soviet Union perceived itself to be at the peak of its power, the United States used the opportunity in Afghanistan and sponsored the Afghan Mujahideen as a resistance against the occupying Soviet forces by working with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. This eventually led to the defeat of the Soviet forces in Afghanistan, and as they retreated from Afghanistan, it brought into question the superpower status of the Soviet Union. This directly contributed to the disintegration of Soviet Union, which marked the end of the Cold War. Because the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan emboldened its rivals like the US and other democratic nations, whereas Soviet republics in Eastern Europe and Central Asia started questioning the relevance of communist policies, which eventually led to the fall and disintegration of the Soviet Union. So, on similar lines, the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan after failing to defeat the Taliban marks a similar event as it leads to the questioning of the US superpower status. According to the writer, this is going to lead to doubts amongst American allies, especially in Western Europe and in Asia Pacific, and there is a likelihood that American allies might move away from such partnerships and seek to form newer alliances in order to protect their own interests. Then American rivals will feel emboldened that the United States is a superpower which is on the decline, and this could lead countries like Russia, Iran, and of course China to adopt further aggressive policies which could further destabilize the world and could push the world towards newer conflicts, which could push global geopolitics towards a new kind of disorder. In fact, we are already seeing signs of this. For example, Russia is seen to be getting very aggressive along its borders with Ukraine, and it is being reported that Russia has amassed lakhs of troops along the Ukrainian border, and Western intelligence agencies fear that Russia is planning to invade Ukraine and possibly annex the country. Then, according to reports, Russia is also exerting pressure on the European Union by triggering a refugee crisis along the Belarus Poland border in a possible attempt to firmly establish its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe as a part of its ongoing geopolitical rivalry with the United States, with West European countries, and with military alliances like the NATO. Then in West Asia, Iran appears to have further accelerated its nuclear weapons program despite the threat of American sanctions, and it seems to be in no mood to bend during the ongoing negotiations to possibly restore the nuclear deal which the US had earlier quit. So, as European countries and the United States are trying to renegotiate the nuclear deal, Iran is seen to be taking a tougher stand, and it appears to have further accelerated its nuclear weapons program, all of which further marks the erosion of American power status in West Asia. Then the same can be seen to be happening in the South China Sea as well, and as well as across the Indo Pacific region, where China has successfully challenged the American dominance and is seen to be aggressively reacting to its disputes with Taiwan and with other Southeast Asian countries. So, this growing confidence of its rivals and the increasing doubts amongst its allies creates very tough foreign policy choices for the United States. And as it struggles to retain its superpower status, it could very well lead to the restructuring of the global geopolitical order. Now, let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which refers to a diplomatic dispute that has emerged between the United States and Bangladesh. See, recently, the US Treasury Department has imposed economic sanctions against a paramilitary unit and a security force of Bangladesh. The RAB, or the Rapid Action Battalion of Bangladesh, has been sanctioned by the United States on the account of committing gross human rights violations. See, the Rapid Action Battalion is a paramilitary force of Bangladesh responsible for the country's internal security. It also collects intelligence on organized criminal activities, and as a part of its mandate, it is responsible for dealing with drug trafficking, arms trafficking, smuggling, etc. So, in its role as a security force and as an intelligence gathering force, the RAB is accused to have committed gross human rights violations, and allegedly it is held responsible for hundreds of illegal disappearances in the country, including allegations of extrajudicial killings and torture against the security force. These allegations of gross human rights violations by the security force was seen to be affecting American foreign policy interests, and hence the US has decided to impose economic sanctions against this paramilitary force of Bangladesh by relying upon the provisions of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which was enacted by the US Congress in 2012 and was signed into law by then US President Barack Obama. This law, also popularly known as the Magnitsky Act, was introduced by the United States to primarily target Russia, which was seen to be violating the human rights of political activists and political dissidents. So initially, the act was enacted by the US Congress and signed by the US President to impose economic sanctions against those Russian officials who were responsible for targeting political opponents. Later, the same law has been used to target other countries as well, such as China, for violating human rights of the Uyghur Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang province. So, Chinese security officials and administrators who are working in the Xinjiang province have also been sanctioned by the US through the Magnitsky Act. Similar sanctions have also been invoked against few officials of North Korea, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, who have all been alleged to have committed human rights violations. But these sanctions of the US imposed against other countries on the grounds of human rights violations has always raised a debate, because some accuse the US of using human rights as an issue to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries in order to further its own geopolitical interests. But others believe that such sanctions by the US against genuine cases of human rights violations definitely has the deterrent impact, as the fear of American sanctions can deter other officials and other countries from blatantly violating the human rights of minorities and political opponents. The editorial even acknowledges that the US government sometimes uses these sanctions as a geopolitical tool to target its rival countries for furthering its own selfish geopolitical interests and not with a genuine intention of protecting and upholding human rights. But however, the editorial is also of the opinion that these economic sanctions by the US definitely has the deterrent impact despite the geopolitical motives of the US. The sanctions can be crippling on few governments and especially on few officials who are targeted, which could possibly help in preventing future human rights violations. So, in this regard, the editorial welcomes the sanctions of the United States against the Rapid Action Battalion of Bangladesh and hopes that these sanctions have the true deterrent effect against other authoritarian governments and officials, which could possibly help in preventing human rights violations in the future. Now, as we come to the end of our discussion, let's look at our mains practice questions. The first question: what is the global gateway strategy of the European Union? How can India partner with EU's global gateway for creating links and not dependencies? The second question: in India, the state's ritualistic attachment with the procedures of democracy has not been matched by an awareness of its implicit goal of a fulfilling life for Indians. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So before we end the discussion for today, let me remind you again to like our videos and to comment and as well as to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So that is it for today. Thanks for watching.